Okay, so we're talking about religion this week, but it's probably useful to put into a larger context what we mean in terms of religion for the context of anthropology, because religion usually, when we use the word, has this synonym with large organized religion, and that's not at all the case here. We're looking at the ways that different people are talking about spirituality on a much larger basis. Just like when you use the word spirituality, it also has to do with things that are not connected to religion as an organized thing. And obviously, that's not the case. So today we're looking at the kind of roots of the study of religion for anthropology, or with the predecessor of anthropology called ethnology, from E.B. Taylor. E.B. Taylor was mostly important by bringing back this term of animism into the domain of social sciences to refer to what he calls the deep-lying doctrine of spiritual beings, which embodies the very essence of spiritualistic as opposed to materialistic philosophy. Animism is not a new technical term, though now seldom used. And so the larger idea here is that during the 19th century, people around Europe who were discovering the world outside of Europe were faced with the possibility that you had the different religion, a different belief system. And at the time, it didn't sit well that you could consider a religious system that didn't have Jesus in it, or maybe more largely Abrahamic cultures as a whole. Judaism was not very well regarded, as you probably know from World War I and World War II. Um, Islam was not very well known, but generally also excluded from the Abrahamic sense. So it was very much a Christian dominated world at the time. And to consider the religion of non-Christian people was also to put into contrast the influence of the Christian culture and the Christian faith in Europe. And so, very much so, the study of non-Christian religion was kind of relegated to a subdomain, or what people tend to call very much pagans. At least that's the language that is used in the Bible. Now, we're not going to use this language, of course, and Tyler, to avoid that kind of language, uses the word animism to refer to these larger spiritual senses. That being said, the word itself, animism, is not great, and it has become loaded with a similar system, not necessarily of discrimination against Christianity, but more a system that is discriminating against non-Western systems. And in Tyler's same study, he is pointing out the question, are there or have there been tribes of men so low in culture as to have no religion concept whatsoever? This is practically the question of the University of Religion, which for so many centuries has been affirmed and denied with a confidence in striking contrast to the imperfect evidence on which both affirmation and denial have been based. And so I think I mentioned Tyler before in the context of this class. Tyler was an evolutionary thinker, or what he called a survivalist. That is, that he was looking for survivals of quote unquote primitive cultures inside those indigenous cultures around the world. And as a result of that, he saw animism as a survival of the form of religion that would eventually evolve to be Christianity. In other words, that he was seeing that they had a kind of a baby version of religion, a kind of elemental version of religion that would eventually grow into Christianity. Now, it's important to point out, and again, I'm putting this as the front loading to this class, that Tyler, by his trade, is today kind of considered an anthropologist, but he was practicing a different science than we did at the time. Um, Tyler is a what people would tend to call armchair anthropologist. That is, that he was mostly studying these other cultures from the point of view of his armchair, from not necessarily traveling himself, but reading the words of travelers around indigenous cultures. And so therefore, he didn't have a firsthand experience of what he was talking about. He was mostly gathering what other people, not necessarily scientists or even trained people, were seeing about the world. So part of his study is very biased in that sense. And of course, seeing the world through the lens of Christian folks, the idea of non-Christian folks being around was also the idea of people that could be converted to Christianity. And obviously, this is not the kind of thinking that we are advocating for here, and this is certainly not the larger context for today, but it is important to point out, especially because when Tyler brings in this world of animism, he is also kind of putting the principle into people's minds that perhaps the elemental form of religion is also a form that could be separate from the religious sense that people would understand here. So again, this is kind of a word of language, religion, spirituality, animism, cults, whatever. All those things are pretty similar to our purposes, in as much as none of them are particularly loaded with positive or negative sense. But more importantly, for the context of animism, the most important part was the organization around a natural system or a natural viewpoint of some sort. And this is something that is obviously pretty common for anthropology, for a discipline that was born out of this observation of nature and culture. And of course, for the context of religion as a means to connect with nature, there is the possibility of seeing kind of a bridge, if you will, or a way in which the religious systems would be connecting our natural world with our cultural world, the ones that is practiced in our cities and maybe, in our churches. Philippe Descola, a French anthropologist who studied especially South American indigenous folks, was looking at animism in a different way, and he brought back that same term with the understanding that it was not entirely accurate as it was used by Tyler, but he brought back that word of animism mostly as a connection, very literally, between this religious aspect and the natural aspect. And so he points out, if one strips the definition of animism of its sociological correlations, there remains one characteristic that everybody can accept and that the etymology of the term indicates, which is why I chose to preserve it despite the dubious uses made of it in the past. So literally referring to Tyler. That characteristic is the attribution by humans to non-humans of an interiority identical to their own. This attribution humanizes plants and above all animals, since the soul with which it endows them allows them not only to behave in conformity with the social norms and ethical precepts of humans, but also to establish communicative relations both with humans and among themselves. And so the larger idea, as Descola points it out, is the idea that animism is very much a matter of the soul and putting a soul into things that are not human. In this case, plants or animals, maybe non-humans that are not currently alive, other things that could be part of our world that we might see a movement in, and that movement would be attributed to the idea of a soul. So the context here is very much the idea of how we are relating to nature, and especially whether that nature is more or less close to us, more or less connected to us, and maybe, again, perhaps, we could have, as part of our spiritual world, an understanding of nature as being kind of part and parcel out of it, that our existence, cultural though it may be, is not just a fight against nature in which the humans would come out to be successful, of course, by creating our large amounts of concrete that we put on top of nature, but more importantly, that we are living in some kind of relationship with our nature. And of course, in the context of indigenous folks, the context of having a relationship to your natural environment is something that is, almost a stereotype at this point, that you might have a connection to nature that is more than a matter of economics, more than a matter of sustenance, but also a matter of spirituality. And so that kind of brings us back to Latour that we talked about last week, who actually passed away over the weekend, in a weird coincidence. Latour points out to the idea that, of course, those actors and networks that we mentioned were also a matter of the connection of humans to their culture and their natural world. So he points out in 2004 Whereas culture never offered anything but a particular viewpoint on common nature and could not supply any enlightenment about its single particularity, every collective can participate in the manufacture of the common world of essential requirements, an expression that I borrow, like that of traceability, from the world of standardization practice and quality control. In other words, with the old principle of triage, what was essential was always already known. With the new, what is essential is still to come. So in that case here, of course, if we are thinking of nature as the world that we live in, and perhaps as the world that we are evolving in, not humans on top of nature, but humans with nature, our actors and our networks would be connected through a natural world, perhaps a natural world that we are endowing with some kind of spiritual life, or maybe in the more modern sense, a natural world that we kind of have to sustain in order to sustain ourselves. If our air is no longer breathable, if our water is no longer drinkable, we are not going to survive this. And so the networks that we are connecting through here also has to do with the traceability element that he mentions through the other context around us. And that context could be natural. It could also be, our ancestors, our ghosts, if you will, that exist as part of our existence, and the things that we have to deal with, maybe the previous decisions that were made by our predecessors. And so, in using Tyler's animism as a starting point, we can kind of boil down our relationship to religion through those very wide terms anyway. Again, not necessarily taking his idea, but mostly taking his word and applying that word to our study of religion. Tyler mentions animism as what he calls the doctrine of human and other souls, because there is the possibility of a soul existing outside of humans, again, perhaps in the form of a ghost, but also perhaps in the form of an animal or a plant, or maybe a mountain or a cloud or something of the sort. In that case, if we endow other things around our world with the possibility of a soul, we are kind of also endowing them with some kind of importance in our world. And whether or not we pay attention to that is kind of a matter of our larger worldview. Another aspect that Tyler mentions is an idea of pervading life and will in nature. And this is also pretty important in our relationship to nature as a whole, because if we think of nature as being, not alive, perhaps dead or dying to a certain extent, we will not take this into account as part of our decision making. And nature could serve as a trove of resources that we can use. Again, that would assume a lack of life into it, because the food that we eat, we cut it out, and so therefore we cut it out of life. But if we think of nature as being alive, maybe we would have a little bit more thinking towards the senses that we are dealing with our life and with the nature around us. And more largely, what Tyler calls is a view of animism is the theory of the universal animation of nature. And that one is an easy one to think about in terms of spirituality, because you might see that nature is being moved in certain ways. Maybe nature is, quote unquote, making decisions for you, pushing you to do this and that, or maybe driving you in a way that allows you to miss some other event in your life or something or another. Now, if you think of this as part of the universe telling you something, for example, well, this is a matter of animism, something that would not be typically considered to be religion in the Western sense, because, of course, in the Western sense, there is God and not much else. Here, we are thinking of the universe in the most various sense as something that is worth having a voice in our world. And if the universe is telling us anything, then we are beginning this system of animism, or perhaps, a religious system that is based on a natural worldview. And so for our purposes here, of course, in terms of a digital religion or a digital form of religion, seeing that nature could be taken into account into our religious system also opens up the possibility of our networks, including nature with the digital communications in between. This is from a study from this week's reading, looking at digital religion, saying that there is no need to believe in any particular doctrines, nor is one obliged to trust in their antiquity or their scientific basis. The ultimate litmus test is whether you can experience their veracity for yourself. This is precisely what distinguishes personal experiences from, for instance, errors or sinful deeds, notions which rely both on external standards of legitimacy. More specifically, as we have seen, New Age understands emotions such as love, pain, pleasure, anger, or happiness as personal reactions to events in the outer world that convey vital spiritual knowledge about one's inner world, about the sort of person one quote unquote really or quote unquote at deepest is. So the article focuses more on what they call New Age religions, because of course the idea of living in a new age also means an age that is mediated by technology, that includes UFOs as much as it includes computers, as much as it includes perhaps cell phones, as we are going to see for the rest of the week. Those things that are definitely outside of the, I guess, traditional way that people would see religion, of course, seeing that we are living in a world that is more or less based on a biblical idea. Certainly, the existence of a technology that connects people seems to be very outside of that world, let alone, again, the aliens and the such. In our context here, the possibility that you do not need a religious doctrine and that you can kind of come up with your own idea of what your soul is, what your soul does, what other people's souls do, and what those souls are, also is a very new understanding of a religious sense here, because religion, in and of itself, because we think of it as an organized system, kind of seems to follow some kind of existing rule from somewhere. By contrast, when we think about New Age religion, and especially those newer religious movements that have been appearing in the past 50 years or so, they have to do more with the personal understanding, the personal relations of people, and perhaps with the universe speaking to them directly as people, not through an intermediary of a god, not through the intermediary of a clergy or priest or whatever. It is very much a matter of an organization that is based on that own spiritual life. And so that is the context of what we are going to be talking about this week.